All right, our guest today, Daniel Wagner, is brought to you by our friends over at Four Winds Brewing, more specifically by the Juxtapose IPA. Looking for something hoppy for your fridge this weekend? We recommend you check out the Four Winds Juxtapose IPA, a two-time silver medal winner at the World Beer Cup. This juicy IPA is tropical and funky at the same time. Available at liquor stores across the province or for home delivery anywhere in BC through the online shop at fourwindsbrewing.ca. Our
Oh,
man joining us.
great ad read. Well
Thank
done,
you.
Quads.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Daniel.
Nailed it.
I greatly appreciate that. You've nailed it a few times, most recently, and we're going to have a lot to talk about with you. Filip Hronek, a lot of other stuff that we're going to talk about. Jake Gensel's in the news right now. But the thing I want to start with, you wrote a list about finding the next Dakota Joshua. Riley Tuff is at the top of both of our lists.
Okay, the top is pushing it a little bit, considering I don't actually think that he's the right fit for the Canucks. So, no, he's not at the top of my list. But I did write about finding the next Dakota Joshua. I think one of the things that people kind of miss when they're looking for the next Dakota Joshua is like trying to find an exact replica of Dakota Joshua. So you look for a guy who has the size and all of that. Well, that's not really the point. When Patrick Alvin talked about finding the next Dakota Joshua, he just meant finding a guy who's underrated, who's maybe not getting an opportunity that the coaching staff can take and mold and turn into an impactful player. And so when I wrote about finding the next Dakota Joshua, I specifically looked at all of the Group 6 UFAs, who are players that would be restricted free agents, except they haven't played enough NHL games. So they're not getting an opportunity with their current team. Is there an opportunity in Vancouver to find someone who is, they can sign at next to a league minimum contract and bring into the Canucks organization and try to get him to take those next steps to become an impact player?
Who are some of your top targets from that list? Who's intriguing to you?
Well, I have to admit, as soon as I saw Cole Lind on the list, I was like, why isn't anyone signing Cole Lind? He immediately jumps out, and not just because he's a former Canuck draft pick and we've seen him in the organization before, but because he's been dominating the AHL the last couple seasons, led the AHL playoffs in scoring just 2 seasons ago. He's a guy who isn't getting that opportunity in the NHL and maybe deserves a longer look. And so that's a guy that I'm kind of intrigued by. I'm also looking at Brett Murray, who's a guy in the Buffalo Sabres organization. He kind of fits that Dakota Joshua mold where he's got that size. He's 6'5". He kills penalties. He's physical. He fights. He defends his teammates. He's got a lot of those qualities. He's not as fast as Dakota Joshua, which is maybe a point against him. But he's someone who, again, isn't getting that opportunity, was really good in the AHL this last season. Maybe he's worth a shot. And there's a bunch of other players like that. There's a couple of defensemen, even right shot defensemen that are on that list, like Cameron Crotty, Nick Blankenburg. These are guys that maybe you give an opportunity to these players and they can become a part of the right side depth for the Canucks on defense. But there's a few other players too. And really the risk with those is that they're, quad A players, that they're really good AHLers, but there's a reason why they haven't taken that next step. But, if you take a chance on one of them, you sign them to $800,000 deals, maybe they don't become an NHL player. They just become a really good player in Abbotsford. It's just a little bit of a risk because you'd be paying them a bit more than most AHL stars get, but it's not that big of a risk. You're either getting the next Dakota Joshua or a really good AHL player in Abbotsford.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up Nick Blankenburg on the back end too. I don't know how much Canucks fans have watched him, but few times in the NHL watch him play, and he is fast. He hits like a truck. He is a little bit undersized, but he plays way bigger than his size, and he's really intriguing to me just because Columbus, especially on the right side of the blue line, has had a logjam because they went out and got Goodbranson, Severson, and even their top elite level prospects like David Juracek haven't had an opportunity to play consistent NHL minutes. Maybe there's an opportunity there. When we discussed this concept overall of placing bets on some of these Group 6 UFAs or just players that haven't had an opportunity. From the Canucks perspective, given that these contracts can be buried in Abbotsford and it's not going to affect your cap situation, how much would you like to see the Canucks place these bets in a high level of volume, especially because the Canucks are a bigger market team? And if cash from ownership is the only expenditure, well, you'd think they'd be well positioned to take a high number of cracks at these guys.
Well, that's it exactly. Like a lot of these players, like I said, there's a reason why they haven't gotten an NHL opportunity. And maybe there is an opportunity in Vancouver if you take a shotgun approach, you take a lot of chances on these guys, maybe one of them hits. And I think because you have this situation in Abbotsford where it's right down the road, you can have your NHL coaches, the Sedins or other development coaches like Jason Krog now as their skills coach. He can spend time with them in Abbotsford and potentially in Vancouver. That's a really nice opportunity in terms of development. That maybe those players could take that next step with that situation in the AHL. And Abbotsford has a couple players who are potentially leaving, like a guy like Sheldon Dries. And so maybe there's an opportunity for those players to take a leadership role in Abbotsford if they're not that next Dakota Joshua in the NHL.
Tell me about Brett Murray. He's tall. Like, you put him in
He's
the as Riley Tough. So this might be my new guy here.
I just delivered you your new guy. Well, one of the things that I found when just looking into him a little bit, again, the foot speed is an issue. That's something that, from what I've read, he's taken steps towards addressing. The Rochester Americans love him. The coach in Rochester loves him, calls him one of their most physical players, their best puck protector, a guy who has a major impact on puck possession just because he does those things on the boards, protecting the puck, winning puck battles that a head coach loves. And if that doesn't sound like a Rick Tocchet guy, I don't know who does. So maybe that foot speed is an issue. So maybe that's the reason why he hasn't stuck in the NHL. But when he was in the NHL for a few games this last season, he showed pretty well. His underlying numbers were really good. And that's one of the things that with Dakota Joshua, he had really good underlying numbers before he came to Vancouver. There were a lot of indications that he had more to give. And that's where I look at someone like Riley Tuft and it's like, his underlying numbers are not good at all. And so you wonder, does he have more to give, or is that who he is, a player who can't quite make it to the NHL?
I wanted to ask you about Filip Hronek. You've written a couple of excellent articles recently on him, one sort of doing a deep dive into more of his on-ice performance, and one that looked at his arbitration situation, his contract status. Starting with the arbitration side of things, that's been brought up a lot because that's one of the strongest leverage points he has. What did you learn just looking at his potential arbitration comps, and what should Canucks fans take away?
Well, one of the interesting things with arbitration is what you're allowed to use in arbitration. So you are allowed to use only the statistics that the NHL provides, like on their website. So you can't use third-party statistics. Anything that you would use to kind of prove that Filip Hronek is maybe held up by Quinn Hughes, you can't use that because all of that proof is coming from third-party Wowie, with or without you kind of statistics. You can't really use that. So you're allowed to use things like games played, points, time on ice, situational time on ice, whether it's special teams, penalty kill, power play. The NHL does provide a version of Corsi, and so that is available. And so all of those numbers, all of those statistics look really, really good for Filip Hronek. And anything that you would use to maybe undercut him and maybe say, well, he's not actually that good because look how he performs with other defensemen other than Quinn Hughes. You can't use any of that because it's not available from the NHL. So that
NHL Edge data? Do you know the answer to that?
I don't actually know the answer to that. My guess is yes.
And they were like, yeah, he has too little speed bursts under. We got to get rid of him.
That NHL Edge data is really odd and funny and weird, and I don't know how applicable any of it is to actual on ice performance. So as far as I know, yes, you would be able to use that. It is official NHL data. It can be used in arbitration. I don't know whether that helps Hronek or it helps the Canucks because it's just really weird data.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when you look at comparable players based on what you can use in arbitration, you end up with guys like Mikhail Sergachev and Jacob Trouba. And you're talking about players that lead to a cap hit of not 8 million, you're looking at 9 million. like that's like that's what that works out to. Sergachev's cap hit, his contract based on next year's salary cap would come up to more than $9 million. And so when that's a comparable, you can understand why the Canucks are concerned. Now the Canucks can reply with things like Neil Pionk, Ryan Pulock, who are much lower. You're looking more towards 6 million, but that's a huge gap between 9 million and $6 million. And even if the arbitrator comes in between those, you're still looking at 7.7 to 7.9 to $8 million as a cap hit for Hronek. So you can see why the Canucks would look at arbitration and be concerned.
Yeah.
Daniel, from your perspective, how would you approach the Hronek situation big picture? Are you wanting to re-sign him long term? Would you be testing the trade market on him? How easily replaceable do you think he'd be? Curious your thoughts.
The thing with Hronek is that he's still a really good defenseman. People kind of have been down on him because of how he performed in the second half of the season. There's now been rumors put out there about him being injured and that affecting his play. What's interesting here is that there's multiple deadlines here. There's the draft coming up. They could potentially trade him at the draft, but teams are sometimes a little hesitant to trade away draft picks at the draft because that's what they've been building towards. Their scouts are really excited about those. And then you've got the arbitration deadline when Hronek can file for arbitration on July 5th. And then you have his actual arbitration hearing. So you have like 3 separate deadlines here where the Canucks can continue to try to negotiate a contract. And if it doesn't work out, then you can maybe look at trading him. It doesn't have to happen at the draft if they are going to trade him. And for me, like the offer has to be fantastic because the Canucks don't have to trade him at all. So if the offer is right, yeah, sure, maybe you move Hronek, but I don't think he's easy to replace, especially not in free agency where you're going to be spending a lot of money on potentially a player who does not have the same impact on Quinn Hughes. I don't know if it's worth it to go that route. I think it would be safer for them to go long-term with Hronek.
Daniel, good stuff as always. We really appreciate it, and we will chat with you later.
Sounds good.